The village of Savona is a place defined by its smallness. Located in the southern tier of New York within Steuben County, it is a community where the population rarely breaks 1,000 residents. In the summer of 1993, it was the quintessential American backdrop, a grid of quiet streets and manicured lawns bordered by the Cohocton River. It was the kind of town where the rhythm of life was dictated by the church bells and the seasonal shifts of the surrounding farmland. Residents knew not just their neighbors' names, but their work schedules, their children's ages, and the models of the cars parked in their driveways. Doors were frequently left unlocked, and bicycles were abandoned on front lawns without fear of theft. The concept of stranger danger existed only as an abstract warning from television, not as a palpable threat within the village limits. This sense of security was the town's most valued currency, a silent agreement among the families that this was a safe harbor. On the morning of the 2nd of August 1993, the humidity hung heavy over the valley, promising a sweltering afternoon. For 4-year-old Derrick Robie, the weather mattered little. He was vibrant, a bundle of preschool energy with bright blue eyes and a mop of blonde hair that seemed to capture the sunlight. To his parents, Dale and Doreen Robie, Derrick was the center of their world. He was a child who embodied the innocence of his age, affectionate and eager to please. He loved t-ball, cartoons, and the simple exploration of the world immediately outside his front door. The Robie household was one of warmth and stability, grounded in the values of the community around them. They were raising Derrick to be kind, to be open, and to trust the environment he was born into. That Monday morning marked a small but significant milestone in Derrick's young life. He was preparing to attend the summer recreation program at the local park, a hub of activity for the village children. The park was located just a short distance from the Robie home, a walk that took only a few minutes for an adult but represented a grand journey for a 4-year-old. Derrick was getting ready to walk alone to the program for the first time. It was a decision born of the era and the setting. In 1993, Savona, allowing a child to walk a block or two to a supervised playground, was not seen as negligence, but as a standard step in growing up. His mother, Doreen, helped him get dressed in a t-shirt and shorts, preparing him for a day of games and crafts. There was a sense of pride in the transaction, the loosening of the tether that allowed a boy to feel like a big kid. While Derrick Robie was preparing to step out into the sunlight, another child in Savona was navigating a much darker internal landscape. Eric Smith was 13 years old, but he occupied a space on the periphery of the village's social structure. Physically, he stood out in ways that made him a target for the cruelty of his peers. He had bright red hair, freckles, and protruding ears, features that earned him relentless teasing. He wore thick, plastic-rimmed glasses to correct strabismus, a condition that caused his eyes to cross, further distinguishing him from the other boys his age. In the hierarchy of middle school social dynamics, Eric was at the bottom, frequently bullied and ostracized. He was often called names like Carrot Top or Freak, labels that chipped away at his self-worth day after day. Eric's home life and psychological state were markedly different from the nurturing environment Derrick enjoyed. While his family provided for him, Eric was a volatile child. He was known to have a short fuse, prone to intense tantrums that seemed disproportionate to the triggers. He would later be diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder, a condition characterized by sudden episodes of unwarranted anger. But in the summer of 1993, he was simply seen by many as a troubled, moody boy. He struggled academically and socially, retreating into himself when he wasn't lashing out. He was a loner, often seen wandering the village streets or riding his bike in solitude, observing the world through the thick lenses of his glasses with a gaze that few bothered to meet. The divergent paths of these two boys were carved by age, temperament, and circumstance. Derrick was just beginning to engage with the world, his experiences limited to the safety of his backyard and the affection of his parents. He viewed the village as a playground, a vast extension of his home where everyone was a potential friend. Eric, conversely, viewed the village as a landscape of rejection. At 13, he was entering the turbulent waters of adolescence, without a life raft. He carried a simmering resentment, a quiet rage directed at a world that seemed to mock him. He had been suspended from the same summer recreation program Derrick was heading toward, a detail that left him with empty time and no structure on that August morning. As the clock ticked toward mid-morning, the separation between these two lives began to close. Derrick Robie watched her son leave the house. She gave him a kiss and watched him walk down the driveway. The image of the small boy walking away, full of confidence and excitement, would be seared into her memory. She watched him until he turned the corner, satisfied that he was safely on his way to the park just down the street. It was a routine departure, devoid of any premonition. The air was still, the neighborhood quiet. There were no screeching tires, no suspicious vans, no strangers lurking in the shadows. The danger that awaited Derrick was not an intruder from the outside world, but a product of the village itself. Eric Smith was also moving through the village. He was on his bicycle, aimless and unsupervised. He had no destination, only the restless energy of a bored and angry teenager. The geography of Savona forced their trajectories to align. The village is compact, with a limited number of routes leading to the central recreation area. Eric was familiar with the layout, familiar with the shortcuts and the wooded patches that bordered the manicured zones. One such area was a small wooded copse near the baseball field, a place locally known as the Jagged Rocks. It was a rough, unkempt patch of land that offered seclusion from the open view of the park and the street. The contrast between the two boys as they drew closer was stark. Derrick was a symbol of vulnerability, physically small and emotionally open. He walked with the trust of a child who had never been given a reason to fear. Eric was a vessel of pent-up aggression, physically superior in size and strength, and carrying the emotional scars of years of ridicule. The psychological distance between them was vast. Derrick was living in the immediate joy of the moment, thinking about the games he would play. Eric was trapped in a cycle of brooding, likely replaying past humiliations or nursing the chronic anger that defined his emotional state. When Eric Smith spotted Derrick Robie, the younger boy was walking alone. In the mind of the 13-year-old, the sight of the solitary child triggered something incomprehensible to the average observer. It was not a predatory instinct born of need or survival, but a darker impulse that had been festering in the isolation of his own mind. Derrick was an easy target, a proxy for the power Eric felt he lacked in every other aspect of his life. The power dynamic was instantly and irreversibly skewed. To Eric, Derrick was not a neighbor or a playmate. He was an opportunity to exert control. The interaction began benignly enough to any distant observer. Eric approached Derrick. To a 4-year-old, a 13-year-old is an authority figure, a big kid to be listened to. When Eric spoke, Derrick likely listened with the same obedience he showed his parents or teachers. Eric used this inherent trust to his advantage. He didn't snatch the child screaming from the sidewalk. He didn't use a weapon to coerce him. He used words, leveraging the social contract of the village that said, "Older children look out for younger ones." He told Derrick to come with him. He lured him off the safety of the paved road and toward the shortcut that led to the wooded area. Derrick, clutching his small lunch, or perhaps just swinging his arms in the summer heat, followed. He had no frame of reference for malice. His world was populated by people who loved him. The idea that this older boy, a familiar face from the village, would wish him harm was a concept that did not exist in his reality. They walked together, a mismatched pair moving away from the safety of the public eye and into the shadows of the trees. The village continued its morning routine around them. Lawns were mowed, mail was delivered, and phones rang in empty houses. The silence of Savona, usually a comfort, now became a conspirator, masking the movements of the two boys as they stepped off the sidewalk. This walk to the woods was the final bridge between the normalcy of Savona and the horror that would permanently scar its history. It was the moment the timeline split, separating the before from the after. For Dale and Derrick Robie, the clock was still ticking on a normal Monday. They believed their son was at the park, playing with friends. For the community, the illusion of safety remained intact for a few hours longer. But in the woods, Near the baseball field, the quiet village dissolved. The idyllic childhood of Derrick Robie and the troubled, divergent childhood of Eric Smith had finally collided, and the result would shatter the peace of Savona forever. The innocence of the small town was walking hand in hand with a darkness it had nurtured but failed to see, heading toward a tragedy that defied all logic and reason. Friends. That assumption was the cornerstone of the morning, a belief anchored in the absolute predictability of life in Savona. To understand how such a horrific deviation could occur unnoticed, one must examine the precise architecture of that Monday morning, a timeline that began with innocent excitement and ended in a silence that would haunt the village for decades. The 2nd of August 1993 broke over Steuben County with the heavy, damp heat typical of late summer in the southern tier of New York. In the Robie household, the atmosphere was busy but cheerful. 4-year-old Derrick Robie was awake and brimming with the specific, focused energy of a child anticipating an event. He was preparing to attend the summer recreation program at the local park, a daily ritual that served as the social hub for the village's children. Derrick, small for his age but fiercely independent, viewed the program as a place of adventure. He was a boy who loved t-ball and playing in the dirt, possessing a trusting nature that had never been given a reason to recoil from the world. Derrick Robie, his mother, moved through the morning routine with the efficiency of a parent balancing the needs of a preschooler and the household. She helped Derrick get dressed, selecting a green t-shirt and a pair of shorts, an outfit that would later become a searing visual marker in the minds of search parties and law enforcement. Derrick's preparation was not just about clothing, it was about the small artifacts of childhood independence. He packed his bag, ensuring he had his snack for the day. It was a mundane task, yet for a 4-year-old, it represented a claim to maturity. He was a big boy going to the park. The conversation that morning shifted to the logistics of his transit. The park was not a distant destination requiring a car ride, it was intimately close. The recreation field was located just down the street, a distance of approximately 1 block from the Robie home. In 1993, in a village the size of Savona, the concept of stranger danger existed as an abstract warning rather than an immediate operational threat. The community was tight-knit, the kind of place where neighbors recognized each other's children by their gait or the color of their bicycles. Derrick asked his mother if he could walk to the park by himself. It was a request born of his desire to be grown up, to match the independence of the older children he idolized. Doreen evaluated the request against the reality of their environment. The walk was short, it was daylight. The street was familiar. She agreed, a decision that was entirely within the norms of the time and place. She watched him as he prepared to leave, the heavy wooden door of their home framing the last image of her son in the safety of his domestic life. Before he stepped out, she gave him a kiss goodbye, a reflex of affection that would retroactively gain the weight of a final farewell. Derrick stepped out of the house around 9:30 a.m. The humidity was already rising, the air thick and still. He carried his bag, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement as he began the short trek toward the recreation program. He was alone, but he did not feel isolated. The village was his extended backyard. He walked with the purpose of a child on a mission, his destination visible in his mind, if not yet fully in his line of sight. Simultaneously, the timeline of the morning was being tracked by another figure in the village, one whose routine was driven by a very different internal state. Eric Smith, 13 years old, was also navigating the streets of Savona. Smith was a familiar sight to the locals, often seen riding his bicycle, a solitary figure with thick glasses and red hair. Unlike Derrick, who was moving toward social connection, Smith was drifting. He had been suspended from the recreation program earlier that summer for behavioral issues, effectively exiled from the hub of activity that Derrick was so eager to join. Smith was cycling through the neighborhood, a presence that registered as background noise to the few residents who might have glanced out their windows. He was an adolescent known for being a loner, often the target of bullying due to his appearance and protruding ears, but he was not viewed as a predator. The community saw a socially awkward teenager, not a threat. On this particular morning, Smith's path was aimless until it wasn't. He spotted the small figure of Derrick Robie, walking alone. The geography of the encounter was banal. It happened on a quiet street, under the open sky. As Derrick made his way toward the park, he crossed paths with Smith. The interaction was brief and, to any distant observer, unremarkable. It did not look like an abduction. There was no struggle, no black van, no screaming. It was simply one boy stopping to talk to another. Derrick, conditioned to trust older children and authority figures, did not recoil when Smith engaged him. Smith, utilizing the inherent authority of his age, told Derrick to come with him. He suggested a shortcut or a diversion, exploiting the younger boy's curiosity and trust. Derrick, likely believing he was being included in a game or shown something interesting by an older peer, complied. He stepped off his intended path. The deviation was subtle. A turn away from the baseball diamond, away from the supervisors and the other children, and toward a vacant lot near the park that bordered a wooded area. This was the critical juncture. The walk to the park, which should have taken only a few minutes, was terminated not by force, but by manipulation. Derrick Robie, clutching his snack bag, followed Eric Smith. The distance they traveled together was short, yet it traversed the immense psychological gap between the safety of the village streets and the isolation of the brush. Doreen Robie, back at the house, went about her morning. She glanced at the clock, noting the time. In her mind, Derrick had already arrived. He was checking in with the counselors. He was running onto the field. He was opening his snack. The mental image was clear and comforting. She had no way of knowing that the walk had been intercepted. The silence of the house was peaceful, not ominous. Outside, the atmosphere began to change. The sky, which had been hazy, threatened rain, a meteorological shift that would later complicate the crime scene. But in those crucial minutes, shortly before 10 a.m., the village remained quiet. The few cars passing by did not slow down. Neighbors tending to their lawns did not look up. The invisibility of the crime was its most chilling feature. It was happening in broad daylight, within shouting distance of safety, masked by the sheer improbability of violence in Savona. Derrick followed Smith past the manicured lawns, past the boundary of the recreation area, and toward the rocks and the weeds. He walked willingly, his trust intact, his small legs keeping pace with the 13-year-old. He was walking away from the morning routine and into a nightmare that had no precedent in the village's history. The paved road gave way to uneven ground. The sounds of the potential playmates at the park grew fainter, replaced by the rustle of the undergrowth and the heavy breathing of the teenager beside him. The walk to the park had ended. The walk into the darkness had begun. The jagged terrain that separated the groomed recreation fields from the residential streets of Savona served as a harsh boundary line between safety and isolation. While the village stood as a model of small-town visibility, this specific patch of earth, cluttered with scrub brush, dirt, and scattered rocks, offered a pocket of privacy that would prove fatal. Eric Smith, 13 years old, with a frame significantly larger than that of a preschooler, guided 4-year-old Derrick Robie away from the paved route that led to the supervised summer program. The distance from the sidewalk to the kill zone was not a journey of miles, but of mere yards, yet the psychological separation was absolute. Once they stepped off the manicured grass and into the rougher verge, they exited the social contract of the village and entered a space controlled entirely by Smith's impulses. Derrick Robie carried his innocence like a shield that was entirely ineffective against the threat he now faced. To him, Smith was simply an older boy from the neighborhood, a familiar face in a town where strangers were virtually non-existent. The 4-year-old was clutching his small bag, prepared for a day of games and crafts. He had no frame of reference for the malice that was currently steering him toward the overgrown area near the baseball field backstop. There was no struggle initially. No screaming that alerted the neighbors who were mowing lawns or hanging laundry just houses away. The compliance of the victim was rooted in trust. The intent of the perpetrator was rooted in a rage that had been looking for a target. As they reached the secluded area, the dynamic shifted instantly. The terrain here was uneven, littered with stones of varying sizes, the ground hard-packed and dusty under the August sun. The foliage provided a visual screen, blocking the line of sight from the street and the nearby park entrance. It was a space that existed in the periphery of the community's vision, close enough to hear the sounds of daily life but dense enough to hide a catastrophe. Smith's demeanor, which had been calm enough to lure the younger boy off his path, disintegrated into violence. The transition was abrupt. There was no argument, no provocation from the 4-year-old. The trigger lay entirely within Smith's own psychology, a reservoir of anger that required a release valve. Smith initiated the physical assault by overpowering the much smaller child. The size differential was insurmountable. Smith grabbed Derrick, utilizing a chokehold that cut off the younger boy's ability to vocalize his terror. The mechanics of the strangulation were focused and effective. By compressing the child's airway, Smith silenced the only alarm system Derrick possessed. The struggle was frantic but brief. A 4-year-old's fight for survival against a 13-year-old is mathematically hopeless. Derrick's attempts to breathe, to pull away, were met with the suffocating grip of an aggressor who had committed himself to the act. The boy dropped his bag, the contents a change of clothes and a drink for the summer program spilling or sitting uselessly on the dirt, marking the spot where childhood ended and a crime scene began. The strangulation rendered Derrick semi-conscious or unconscious, but the violence did not cease with the incapacitation of the victim. The rage driving Smith demanded more than simple domination. It required destruction. As the child lay on the ground, vulnerable and gasping, Smith turned his attention to the environment around him. The area was abundant with rocks, heavy and jagged stones that had been churned up from the earth or left behind during construction efforts years prior. These became the weapons of opportunity. Smith did not need to bring a weapon to the scene. The scene provided the means to escalate the assault from battery to murder. Smith lifted a large rock. The act required 2 hands and significant effort, underscoring the deliberation involved. This was not a flailing gesture of panic, but a focused application of force. He brought the rock down on the defenseless boy's head. The impact was devastating, causing massive cranial trauma that shattered the possibility of survival. The silence of the woods was broken only by the dull thud of stone against bone and flesh. The brutality of the bludgeoning indicated a complete detachment from the humanity of the victim. Smith was not merely subduing a threat, he was obliterating an object of his aggression. The medical examiners would later catalog the extent of these injuries, noting the severity of the fractures and the force required to inflict them, evidence that spoke to a frenzy of violence that went far beyond an accidental outburst. The sequence of the attack revealed a disturbing persistence. It was not a single blow followed by immediate regret. Smith continued. He utilized the rocks to inflict further damage, ensuring that the life was extinguished. During the assault, Smith also removed the boy's clothing. This act added a layer of humiliation and exposure to the physical destruction, stripping Derrick of his dignity in his final moments. The clothing was cast aside, becoming part of the debris field that investigators would later have to navigate. The systematic nature of the violence, the strangulation to silence, the bludgeoning to kill, the stripping to expose, suggested a complex web of impulses firing in Smith's brain, a chaotic mix of anger, curiosity, and sadism. Throughout the attack, the summer morning continued around them. The sun climbed higher, the heat intensified, and the shadows in the wooded enclave shortened. Just yards away, the routine of Savona persisted. Cars drove by. The recreation program staff prepared for the arrival of dozens of children. The disconnect between the normal world and the horror unfolding in the woods was absolute. Derrick Robie, who had been walking with a smile just minutes earlier, was now broken on the ground, his future stolen in a burst of inexplicable rage. Smith stood over the body, the adrenaline of the kill likely coursing through him, yet he remained grounded enough to assess his situation. The violence had been physically exhausting. The exertion of strangling a struggling child and lifting heavy rocks left a physical toll. Yet, Smith did not flee in a panic immediately. He lingered long enough to ensure the deed was finalized. He poured the juice from Derrick's Kool-Aid thermos into the wounds, an inexplicable detail that later confounded investigators and psychologists alike. Was it a ritual, a cleanup attempt, or a final act of contempt? The strangeness of the action highlighted the disordered thinking of the 13-year-old killer. It was a gesture that defied logical explanation, adding a surreal and macabre punctuation mark to the brutality. The silence returned to the small patch of woods. The heavy breathing of the killer and the settling dust were the only movements. Derrick lay still. The bright colors of his summer clothes were now stained and scattered. Smith, having completed the act, began the process of disengaging from the reality he had just created. He did not run screaming for help. He did not collapse in remorse. Instead, he adjusted his own composure. He checked his own appearance. The compartmentalization was instantaneous. The boy who had just committed a homicide prepared to step back out onto the pavement as if nothing had happened. Smith navigated his way out of the rocky scrub, stepping back across the invisible line that separated the crime scene from the village. He left Derrick's body hidden by the brush and the topography, invisible to the casual passerby but violently obvious to anyone who would step into the clearing. Smith walked toward the recreation park, the very destination Derrick had been trying to reach. The physical distance between the body and the baseball field was negligible, but the timeline of the village had been permanently bifurcated. There was the time before Eric Smith lured Derrick Robie into the woods, and the time after. As Smith emerged from the trees, he rejoined the flow of the morning. He did not look like a monster to those who saw him. He looked like a teenager in a t-shirt and shorts, perhaps a bit disheveled from playing in the woods, but unremarkable in every other sense. He walked to the park, where other children were gathering, laughing, and playing. He integrated himself into the scene, a wolf in sheep's clothing in the truest, most terrifying sense. He watched the other children, perhaps knowing that just a few hundred feet away, the reality of their safety had been shattered. The secret he carried was massive, heavy, and horrifying, yet he bore it with a disturbing lightness as he went about the rest of his morning. Back in the woods, the stillness was absolute. The insects began to reclaim the silence. The heat of the day baked the rocks and the earth. Derrick Robie remained where he had fallen, a victim of a random intersection of time, place, and a predator's urge. The search for him would not begin for some time. His mother, expecting him to be at the park, would not know to worry for another hour or more. The gap between the commission of the crime and the discovery of the crime was a period of suspended animation for the Robie family, a final hour of ignorant bliss before their world collapsed. But in the woods, the reality was fixed. The luring had worked. The trap had sprung. The rocks had done their terrible work. The intersection of two lives had resulted in the subtraction of one, leaving behind a crime scene that would haunt the conscience of the village for generations. Hour. The morning of August 2 moved with the sluggish pace of high summer, the humidity rising as the sun climbed higher over the sleepy village of Savona. Inside the Robie home, the atmosphere was one of quiet domesticity, anchored by the belief that Derrick was safely under the supervision of the summer recreation program counselors. The routine was familiar, the distance short, and the community tight-knit. There was no precedent in the village's history to suggest that a child walking alone in broad daylight was taking a risk of any magnitude. As the clock ticked toward late morning, the weather began to shift. The bright, oppressive heat that had baked the asphalt earlier in the day gave way to darkening clouds. A summer storm was rolling into the valley, threatening to break the humidity with heavy rain. Derrick Robie, noticing the change in the sky, decided to head over to the park earlier than planned. The recreation program was held outdoors, and she wanted to pick Derrick up before the deluge began. She drove the short distance to the field, expecting to see the chaotic energy of children playing kickball or tag, with her son among them. When she arrived at the park, the scene was winding down. The impending rain had prompted the counselors to dismiss the children or herd them toward shelter. Doreen scanned the faces of the lingering kids, looking for the small, blond boy she had watched walk out the door less than 2 hours prior. He was not immediately visible. She approached the program directors, her query casual at first, asking where Derrick was. The response was the first fracture in her reality. The counselors looked at their attendance sheets, and then back at her. Derrick had never signed in. He had never arrived at the park. The initial reaction was confusion rather than panic. In a village as small as Savona, where boundaries were often fluid and neighbors knew one another, it was plausible that a 4-year-old might have been distracted. Perhaps he had stopped at a friend's house along the way. Perhaps he had seen someone he knew and lingered on a porch. Doreen got back into her car and retraced the route Derrick would have taken. It was a straight shot, a simple path, that should have taken a child no more than a few minutes to navigate. She drove slowly, scanning the sidewalks, the driveways, and the front yards of the houses that lined the street. The familiarity of the neighborhood, usually a comfort, now felt stark. The streets were empty of him. Returning to her house, the anxiety began to sharpen. She called her husband Dale, who was at work. She told him that Derrick hadn't shown up at the recreation program and wasn't at home. The urgency in her voice prompted Dale to leave work immediately. While waiting for him, Doreen began making phone calls. She dialed the neighbors, the parents of Derrick's friends, and anyone who might have seen a small boy in a striped t-shirt walking that morning. No one had seen him. The silence from the community was absolute. He had simply vanished in the span of a single block. By 11 a.m., the sky had opened up, and the rain began to fall, washing over the village streets. The storm added a chaotic element to the growing fear. If Derrick was wandering lost, he was now out in the elements. The Savona police were notified, and the village's volunteer fire department was alerted. The small-town infrastructure, usually reserved for brush fires or minor accidents, pivoted instantly to a search and rescue operation. The siren wailed, a sound that usually signaled fire, but on this day signaled a child gone missing. The mobilization was rapid. In a community of less than 1,000 people, the news traveled by word of mouth faster than any broadcast. Residents stepped out of their homes, donning raincoats and grabbing flashlights, despite the midday hour, as the storm clouds had dimmed the light. They gathered at the fire hall and the park, forming search grids. The logic of the search was predicated on the behavior of a lost child. They looked in culverts, under porches, and in backyards, assuming Derrick had wandered off or hidden from the rain. Derrick Robie arrived back in Savona, joining the search with a frantic intensity. He checked the familiar spots, the places a 4-year-old might be drawn to. The searchers moved in lines, combing through the high grass and the alleys. The police began questioning residents along Derrick's route. "Did you see him? Did you hear anything?" The timeline was reconstructed minute by minute. He had left home shortly before 10 a.m. It was now past noon. 2 hours is an eternity in the life of a missing child, yet the geographical area was so contained that it seemed impossible he hadn't been found. The search radius expanded outward from the path between the Robie home and the park. To the south of the recreation field lay a patch of woods, a dense, overgrown area that separated the manicured grass of the ball field from the wilder, unkempt land beyond. It was a place where older kids sometimes smoked or loitered, but not a place a 4-year-old would typically venture alone. However, as the clear areas were checked and cleared, the searchers turned their eyes toward the darker, more obscured terrain. The rain continued to fall, turning the dirt to mud and slicking the foliage in the wooded areas. The sound of the rain against the leaves made it difficult to hear, forcing searchers to shout Derrick's name over the noise of the storm. "Derrick! Derrick!" The calls echoed through the village, a chorus of desperation that grew louder as the afternoon wore on. Around 2 p.m., the search had been ongoing for nearly 3 hours. The initial hope that this was a simple misunderstanding had evaporated. The collective mood of the village had shifted from concern to dread. People were checking their basements and garages. The New York State Police were brought in to coordinate with the local deputies. A helicopter was requested, though the weather made aerial surveillance difficult. Among the searchers was James Van Heusen, a local resident and volunteer firefighter. He and a small group were assigned to check the wooded area adjacent to the ball field, near a crumbling stone wall and a utility structure. This area was not far from where the children played, but it was visually screened by heavy brush and trees. It was a liminal space, neither fully civilized nor fully wild, often ignored by the daily foot traffic of the village. Van Heusen and his partner pushed through the wet undergrowth. The terrain was uneven, cluttered with rocks and debris. As they moved deeper into the thicket, the sounds of the village, the traffic, the other searchers became muffled. They swept their eyes across the ground, looking for the bright colors of clothing against the earth tones of the forest floor. At approximately 2:55 p.m., nearly 5 hours after Derrick had left his home, the discovery was made. It began with a small, innocuous object. Lying on the ground amidst the leaves and the dirt was a paper lunch sack. It was the type of bag a mother packs for a child, filled with a snack and a drink. Near the bag, spilled onto the ground, was a juice box. The sight of these items froze the searchers. They were domestic artifacts entirely out of place in the wet, dark woods. They signaled that Derrick had been here. He had not just wandered, he had stopped, or been stopped. Van Heusen looked further, scanning the immediate vicinity of the lunch bag. A few yards away, in a small clearing surrounded by trees and rocks, the search came to a devastating halt. Derrick Robie was lying on the ground. The visual reality of the scene was difficult to process. He was not curled up asleep, nor was he huddling from the rain. He was positioned in a way that immediately conveyed the absence of life. His clothing was disarrayed. The small striped t-shirt he had put on that morning was wet and stained. The searchers approached cautiously, the training of the first responders warring with the shock of the neighbors. As they got closer, the brutality of the scene became undeniable. This was not an accident. Derrick had not fallen and hit his head. The trauma to the child's body was extensive and catastrophic. He had been subjected to significant blunt force. Large rocks, pulled from the surrounding terrain, lay near him, stained with evidence of the violence that had occurred. The silence of the woods returned, heavier than before. Van Heusen and the other searcher recoiled, the horror of the discovery physically staggering them. They did not touch the body. The priority instantly shifted from rescue to the preservation of a crime scene. One of the men used his radio to call it in. The code, or the tone of voice, alerted the command center that the search was over, but the nightmare had just begun. "We found him." The message relayed back to the park, where the command post had been established. The ripple effect was immediate. The urgent shouting of names ceased. The frantic movement of the search grids halted. A perimeter was quickly established around the wooded area. Yellow police tape was strung up, sealing off the small patch of woods from the rest of the village. The bright yellow tape stood in stark contrast to the gray afternoon, a definitive barrier between the innocent life of the village and the atrocity that lay behind the trees. For Dale and Doreen Robie, the news was broken not with the relief of a reunion, but with the shattering finality of a homicide investigation. The police chaplain and the senior officers approached them. The parents were kept back. They were not allowed to see their son. The condition of the body was deemed too traumatic, the crime scene too critical to be disturbed by the grief of the family. They were told that Derrick had been found and that he was gone. The rain continued to fall on Savona, washing over the crime scene. Forensics teams were dispatched from the state police barracks. They arrived in white vans, unloading cameras, evidence bags, and protective suits. They stepped carefully into the woods, navigating the same path the killer had taken hours earlier. They documented the lunch bag, the spilled juice, the scattered rocks, and the small, broken body of the boy. The village of Savona, which had woken up that morning as a safe haven, closed its doors that evening as a place of suspicion and terror. The realization settled in that Derrick had been killed within earshot of the baseball field in the middle of the day, while the town went about its business. The predator was not a phantom. The proximity of the body to the park suggested the killer had been right there among them. As the sun went down, floodlights were brought in to illuminate the woods. The stark, artificial light cut through the trees, casting long, twisted shadows. The body was eventually removed, placed into a bag, and carried out of the woods, past the playground where Derrick should have been playing. The physical search was over, but the psychological abyss had just opened up. The question of, "Where is Derrick?" had been answered. Now the village faced a far darker question, one that would haunt them for decades. Who could do this to a child? And worse, Was the killer still watching from behind the curtains of a nearby window? The stark, artificial light cut through the trees, casting long, erratic shadows against the crime tape that now encircled the wooded area near the baseball field. For the investigators of the Steuben County Sheriff's Office and the New York State Police, the scene was a chaotic map of violence that needed to be read with precision. The ground told a story of sudden, overwhelming aggression. Forensic technicians combed through the leaf litter and dirt, marking the locations of blood spatter and the rocks used as bludgeons. The brutality evident on Derrick Robie's body suggested a rage that was difficult to reconcile with the quiet surroundings of Savona. This was not a robbery gone wrong or an accidental death. It was an act of focused, personal destruction. In the days immediately following the discovery, the village of Savona transformed. The trust that had defined the community evaporated, replaced by a suffocating paranoia. Parents refused to let their children out of sight, and the summer recreation program, once a hub of laughter and activity, became a ghost town. The prevailing theory among the terrified residents was that a drifter, a transient predator passing through on the nearby highway, had snatched Derrick. The idea that the monster was a stranger offered a sliver of psychological protection. It was easier to fear the unknown outsider than to look closely at one's neighbors. Police established a command post, and the investigation began in earnest. They set up roadblocks, questioning every driver entering or leaving the village. They canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking residents if they had seen anything unusual on that Monday morning. The timeline was tight. Derrick had left his home alone, a short walk to the park, and was dead minutes later. Whoever had done this had struck quickly and vanished just as fast. As the investigators worked, they began to piece together a list of people who had been near the park that morning. Among the names surfaced that of a 13-year-old boy named Eric Smith. Witnesses placed him in the vicinity of the recreation center around the time Derrick disappeared. It was a routine lead, one of many that needed to be checked. In a small town, teenagers were always around the park. But as the days ticked by, subtle anomalies in Eric's behavior began to draw attention, not just from law enforcement, but from those closest to him. Eric was a known figure in the village, a boy with thick glasses and a history of being bullied for his appearance and his speech. He was often seen riding his bike alone, a solitary presence on the periphery of the town's social life. In the wake of the murder, however, his demeanor shifted. While the rest of the town was paralyzed by grief and fear, Eric seemed energized. He lingered near the command post, watching the police work with an intensity that went beyond idle curiosity. He asked questions that were too specific, too morbid. He wanted to know details about the evidence, about how the police tracked suspects, and, most chillingly, what the legal consequences would be for the person who killed Derrick. Inside the Smith home, the atmosphere was growing heavy with unvoiced suspicion. Eric's family had noticed the change. He wasn't acting like a boy traumatized by a tragedy in his neighborhood. He was acting like a participant waiting for the next act of a play. The pivotal moment came when family members pieced together the timeline and Eric's strange questions. The description released by police of a boy seen near the park, a youth with glasses, carrying a stick, matched Eric. The gnawing dread that the killer might be under their own roof became impossible to ignore. On August 8, 6 days after the murder, Eric's family brought him to the police command post. They didn't drag him there in handcuffs. They brought him in to clear the air, hoping against hope that their worst fears were unfounded. The interrogation began as a conversation. Investigators sat across from the 13-year-old, treating him initially as a potential witness who might have seen the drifter everyone was looking for. But the dynamic in the room shifted rapidly. Veteran detectives are trained to read body language, to spot the tremors of guilt or the inconsistencies in a fabricated story. Eric Smith did not present the jittery anxiety of a child caught in a lie. Instead, he possessed a strange, detached calm. When they asked him about his movements that morning, his story began to fray. He claimed he had been at the park but hadn't seen Derrick. Then he claimed he saw Derrick from a distance. The details didn't align with the physical evidence or the witness statements, placing him much closer to the scene. The investigators pressed gently but firmly. They pointed out the gaps in his narrative. They asked him about the stick he was seen carrying. They asked about the shirt he had been wearing. Slowly, the facade of the innocent bystander crumbled, not with a tearful breakdown, but with a shift in tone. Eric stopped denying his presence. He admitted he had met Derrick on the street. The conversation moved into the dark territory of the crime itself. What followed was a confession that chilled the seasoned investigators to the bone. It was not just the admission of guilt that was disturbing, it was the manner in which it was delivered. Eric described the events of August 2 with a clinical, almost academic precision. He recounted spotting Derrick walking alone, a small figure in a t-shirt carrying a bag for the rec program. He described luring the 4-year-old away from the road, guiding him toward the wooded shortcut that led to the baseball field. There was no shaking voice, no overwhelming remorse. It was a recitation of cause and effect. Eric detailed how he had strangled the younger boy. He explained that he used his hands first, choking Derrick until he fell unconscious. But the violence did not end there. In a monotone, he described picking up rocks from the ground, heavy, jagged rocks that were part of the landscape. He spoke of the mechanics of the bludgeoning, the number of times he struck the child to ensure he was dead. He also described acts of humiliation and violation that occurred during the assault, details that had been held back from the public to verify the killer's identity. He talked about pouring a fruit drink into the victim's wounds. He spoke of pulling down the boy's pants. The detectives listened in stunned silence as the 13-year-old painted a picture of absolute horror. He did not speak of a blackout or a moment of blind panic. He described a conscious progression of violence. When asked why he did it, the answers were muddled, rooted in a generalized rage against the world, against the bullies who tormented him, and against a life he felt was unfair. Derrick Robie had become the proxy for every grievance Eric Smith held. The 4-year-old was simply the available target, the vessel into which Eric poured his accumulated fury. One of the most unsettling aspects for the investigators was Eric's affect. He seemed to derive a certain satisfaction from the attention the interrogation provided. He was finally the center of gravity, the person with the answers everyone sought. The power dynamic that had always worked against him in the schoolyard was reversed in that interrogation room. Here, he held the ultimate secret. He controlled the narrative. Later, psychological evaluations and parole hearings would delve deeper into this aspect, noting a sense of enjoyment or pride he seemed to take in reliving the details, but even in that initial confession, the lack of empathy was palpable. He wasn't crying for Derrick, he was engaged in the process of explaining his work. The confession was corroborated by physical evidence. Eric directed police to where he had hidden the clothes he wore that day, stained with the evidence of his crime. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating finality. The phantom drifter was a myth. The threat had been a local boy, a 7th grader, who rode his bike on the same streets as his victim. When the news broke that an arrest had been made and that the suspect was 13-year-old Eric Smith, the relief in Savona was instantly replaced by a new, more complex trauma. The village could not direct its anger toward a faceless stranger. The killer was the grandson of neighbors, a boy who had sat in their classrooms. The betrayal felt intimate. The investigation had succeeded in catching the culprit, but it had failed to provide any comfort. The why remained an open wound. As Eric was processed and the legal machinery began to turn, the nature of his confession became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. His clear recollection of the events, the step-by-step description of the lure and the murder, stripped away any defense of accidental death or temporary insanity. The interrogation tape captured a boy who knew exactly what he had done and had taken measures to hide it. He had gone home, washed up, and acted normal for days, while the town searched for a monster. The interrogation concluded with Eric Smith in custody, charged with second-degree murder. The detectives who walked out of that room were left to grapple with the reality of what they had just heard. They had looked into the face of a child and found a killer capable of extreme brutality. The case was closed, but the darkness of that confession, the flat, unemotional recounting of extinguishing a 4-year-old's life, hung over the department and the town of Savona like a shroud. The legal battle was just beginning, but the truth of August 2 was now undeniably, horrifyingly clear. The monster was real, and he was 13. The legal proceedings against 13-year-old Eric Smith began in an atmosphere of disbelief that permeated not just the village of Savona, but the entire nation. While the physical search for Derrick Robie had ended in tragedy, the quest for judicial accountability introduced a new, complex struggle within the Steuben County Courthouse in Bath, New York. The community, still reeling from the revelation that the killer was a local middle schooler, found itself grappling with a legal system designed primarily for adults, now applied to a boy who had barely entered his teenage years. District Attorney John Tunney faced the unprecedented task of prosecuting a child for the most heinous of crimes. The state's decision to try Smith as an adult was a pivotal moment, signaling that the severity of the act outweighed the chronological age of the defendant. Under New York law at the time, a 13-year-old charged with second-degree murder could be processed through the adult criminal court system, a grim reality that set the stage for a trial focusing heavily on the concepts of criminal responsibility and moral culpability. The prosecution's strategy was rooted in the tangible evidence and the chilling clarity of Smith's own words. They aimed to prove that despite his youth, Eric Smith possessed the capacity to plan, execute, and conceal a murder, thereby negating any claim that he did not understand the consequences of his actions. Opposing the state was defense attorney Kevin Bradley, who shouldered the difficult burden of humanizing a defendant who had committed an inhuman act. The defense did not contest the physical facts of the killing. The confession and forensic evidence were insurmountable. Instead, Bradley mounted an insanity defense, arguing that Eric Smith was suffering from a severe mental defect at the time of the murder, specifically intermittent explosive disorder. The defense strategy relied on painting a portrait of a troubled, tormented child who had been pushed to a psychological breaking point. They highlighted Smith's history of being bullied for his protruding ears, his red hair, and his thick glasses, suggesting that a lifetime of suppressed rage had erupted in a singular, uncontrollable moment of violence against an innocent proxy. The courtroom became a theater for a battle of psychiatric experts, a common feature in insanity cases, but rarely seen with a defendant so young. The jury, selected from a community that had been intimately scarred by the crime, sat in judgment as psychologists and psychiatrists dissected the mind of the 13-year-old sitting at the defense table. To the observers in the gallery, Smith appeared small and incongruous with the gravity of the charges, often sitting quietly with little display of emotion. This lack of affect became a double-edged sword. To the defense, it was a sign of his dissociation and sickness, while to the prosecution, it was evidence of a cold, remorseless nature. Defense experts testified that Smith's brain chemistry and psychological makeup rendered him unable to control the impulse to kill once it was triggered. They argued that when Smith encountered Derrick Robie that August morning, he was not acting out of malice, but was overtaken by a pathological rage he could not comprehend or arrest. They detailed the mechanism of intermittent explosive disorder, describing it as a seizure-like state where the individual is a passenger to their own violent outbursts. This narrative sought to shift the jury's perception from a calculated killer to a victim of his own biology, a boy whose fuse had simply run out. District Attorney Tunney countered this narrative with a methodical deconstruction of the timeline. The prosecution emphasized the sequence of events that suggested rational thought and decision-making. Smith had spotted Derrick, lured him away from the safety of the road, and led him into a secluded, wooded area. This, Tunney argued, was not the chaotic frenzy of an explosive episode but the predatory stalking of a victim. The prosecutor pointed to the specific details of the assault, noting the escalation of violence and the changing of weapons, from hands to rocks, as evidence of a sustained intent to kill rather than a momentary lapse of control. Crucially, the prosecution focused on Smith's actions immediately following the death of Derrick Robie. The boy had not run for help or collapsed in confusion. Instead, he had removed the victim's clothing in an attempt to stage the scene or satisfy a curiosity, suggesting a level of awareness that contradicted the insanity plea. He had then gone to the creek to wash the blood from his hands, returned home, and engaged in normal activities, even eating a snack. Tunney argued that these were the actions of someone who knew they had done wrong and were actively seeking to avoid detection. The steps taken to hide the crime, concealment, cleaning up, and lying to parents demonstrated a functioning moral compass that had been deliberately ignored, not a mind lost to madness. The most damning piece of evidence remained the confession itself. The jury listened to the taped interrogation where Smith described the killing with a flatness that unnerved those present. He recounted the mechanics of the strangulation and the bludgeoning without the hysterical remorse one might expect from a child who had accidentally or uncontrollably hurt another. The prosecution used this demeanor to dismantle the snapped theory. They posited that Smith's anger at the world, his resentment over bullying, and his feelings of inadequacy were indeed real, but they were motives, not mental defects. They argued that being angry and marginalized did not grant a license to kill, nor did it absolve one of legal responsibility. Throughout the trial, the presence of the Robie family served as a somber anchor for the proceedings. Dale and Doreen Robie watched as the final moments of their son's life were analyzed and debated. The defense's portrayal of Smith as a victim of bullying was difficult for the grieving parents to hear, as it seemed to draw a false equivalency between playground taunts and the brutal murder of a 4-year-old. The prosecution worked to keep the focus on Derrick, ensuring that his memory was not eclipsed by the psychological profile of his killer. They reminded the jury that, while Smith might have had a difficult childhood, the choice to take a life was his alone. The trial judge, Judge Donald Purple, provided the jury with strict instructions regarding the legal definition of insanity in New York. To find Smith not responsible by reason of mental disease or defect, the jury had to believe that he lacked the substantial capacity to know or appreciate the nature and consequences of his conduct, or that such conduct was wrong. The bar for this defense was high. It was not enough to be mentally ill. The illness had to sever the connection between the mind and reality to such an extent that the concept of right and wrong was obliterated. Deliberations began in the summer of 1994, nearly a year after the murder. The 12 jurors held the fate of a child in their hands, tasked with deciding if he was a monster or a tragic figure of mental illness. The deliberations were tense and exhaustive, as the panel weighed the expert testimony against the undeniable horror of the facts. The central question remained: did Eric Smith know what he was doing? The prosecution's timeline of the lure, the kill, and the cover-up proved difficult to reconcile with the idea of a total psychotic break. On the 16th of August 1994, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman announced that they found Eric Smith guilty of second-degree murder. The rejection of the insanity defense signaled that the community and the legal system held Smith fully accountable for his actions. The verdict meant that the jury believed Smith, despite his age and emotional issues, possessed the requisite intent to kill and understood that his actions were wrong at the time he committed them. The intermittent explosive disorder diagnosis, while perhaps explaining his volatility, did not excuse the calculated nature of the crime in the eyes of the law. The sentencing phase followed, cementing the reality of the verdict. Because Smith was a juvenile offender tried as an adult, he was not eligible for the sentences that an adult might face for the same crime, such as 25 years to life. Instead, the maximum sentence available under the law for a 13-year-old convicted of second-degree murder was 9 years to life. Judge Purple, in delivering the sentence, acknowledged the tragedy on both sides but emphasized the absolute finality of the loss suffered by the Robie family. He sentenced Eric Smith to the maximum term, 9 years to life in prison. This sentence meant that Smith would be incarcerated in a juvenile facility until he reached the age of 21, at which point he would be transferred to an adult prison. He would become eligible for parole after serving 9 years, a prospect that loomed in the distant future but guaranteed that the Robie family would have to face their son's killer again. The conclusion of the trial brought a legal resolution, but it offered little emotional closure. The verdict confirmed that a child had killed a child, not out of accident or insanity, but with intent. As the bailiffs led the teenager away to begin his sentence, the village of Savona was left with the judicial confirmation of their worst fears. The monster they had hunted was indeed the boy next door, and he had known exactly what he was doing. Following the imposition of his sentence, Eric Smith was remanded to the custody of the New York State Division for Youth. For the remainder of his adolescence, he resided in the Goshen Secure Center, a juvenile facility where he received education and therapy away from the general adult prison population. These years passed in relative obscurity, shielded by laws protecting juvenile offenders, even as the memory of Derrick Robie remained vivid in the minds of the Savona community. However, the clock was ticking toward his 21st birthday, the statutory threshold that would strip away the protections of the juvenile system. In 2001, Smith was transferred to the custody of the Department of Correctional Services, entering the stark reality of adult prison at the Clinton Correctional Facility before later moving to Collins Correctional Facility. The transition marked the beginning of the punitive phase of his life sentence, placing him among hardened criminals and setting the stage for a decades-long battle over his freedom. The first critical juncture arrived in 2002. Having served the minimum 9 years, Smith appeared before the New York State Board of Parole for the first time. For the Robie family, this was the nightmare scenario they had dreaded since the trial. The structure of the sentence meant that every 2 years, they would be forced to reopen the wounds of August 1993, campaigning to keep their son's killer behind bars. During this initial hearing, the 22-year-old Smith attempted to explain his actions, attributing the violence to suppressed rage caused by bullying and family dynamics. The parole board was unmoved. They focused on the extreme brutality of the crime and the total vulnerability of the 4-year-old victim. The commissioners denied his release, citing that freeing him would be incompatible with the welfare of society and would deprecate the seriousness of the offense. This denial established a grueling cycle that would repeat for nearly 2 decades. In 2004, 2006, and 2008, Smith returned to the hearing room, and each time the result was the same. The transcripts of these hearings often revealed a disconnect between Smith's self-analysis and the board's perception of his remorse. In early hearings, Smith's descriptions of the murder were scrutinized for emotional affect. The board members had access to the full legal history, including the chilling details of the original investigation, where a young Smith had seemingly reveled in the mechanics of the killing. Overcoming that documented history required more than just good behavior. It required a fundamental psychological shift that the commissioners consistently found lacking. They frequently noted that while Smith had completed anger management and other therapeutic programs, his understanding of the magnitude of his actions remained insufficient. For Dale and Doreen Robie, the biennial hearings became a ritual of endurance. They utilized every legal avenue available to ensure their voices were heard, submitting victim impact statements that detailed the permanent void left in their lives. They urged the community to write letters and sign petitions, maintaining a vigilant watch over the process. The system required them to justify their grief repeatedly, a burden that drew national attention to the emotional toll of indeterminate sentencing on victims' families. Each time Smith was denied, relief washed over Savona, but it was always temporary, with the next hearing date looming just 24 months away. As the years progressed into the 2010s, the narrative inside the hearing room began to shift subtly, even as the denials continued. Smith, now a man in his 30s and then 40s, had maintained a largely clean disciplinary record. He earned a high school equivalency diploma and became certified in carpentry and electrical work. He eventually took on a role as a peer facilitator for inmate counseling groups. During hearings in 2012, 2014, and 2016, Smith articulated a more sophisticated understanding of the intermittent explosive disorder diagnosis he had received as a child, claiming he had learned to identify the physical triggers of his rage. He expressed remorse not just for the act, but for the destruction of the Robie family. Yet, the board continued to issue denials, holding firm to the stance that the heinous nature of the murder outweighed his institutional accomplishments. By his 10th appearance in early 2020, Smith had spent more than 2/3 of his life incarcerated. The panel once again rejected his application, maintaining that his release would undermine respect for the law. However, the legal and social landscape regarding juvenile lifers was evolving. criminological understanding of adolescent brain development was influencing how parole boards viewed crimes committed by children, suggesting that the person Smith was at 13 was not the person he was at 40. This context, combined with his spotless prison record and decades of therapy, began to weigh heavier in the balance. The turning point occurred during his 11th parole hearing in October 2021. Smith, now 41 years old, presented his case to the commissioners via video conference. He reiterated his remorse, stating that if he could trade his life for Derrick's, he would. He spoke of his fiancée, a woman he had corresponded with and who provided a stable release plan. This time, after reviewing his risk assessment scores, his extensive programming, and his maturation, the board concluded that his release would no longer be incompatible with the welfare of society. They granted him parole, setting a release date for early 2022. The decision sent shockwaves through the southern tier of New York. The Robie family, who had fought tenaciously for 28 years to keep him imprisoned, expressed their deep disappointment and concern, though they acknowledged the decision was out of their hands. On the 1st of February 2022, Derrick Smith was released from the Woodbourne Correctional Facility. He did not return to Savona. The conditions of his parole were strict, mandating that he reside in Queens County, hundreds of miles away from the scene of the crime. He was subject to a permanent curfew, prohibited from leaving the state without permission, and barred from any contact with the Robie family. After nearly 3 decades of confinement, the man who had entered the system as a 13-year-old boy stepped into a world that had moved on without him, carrying the permanent label of a child killer and the heavy oversight of the state. The conditions of Derrick Smith's parole mandated strictly monitored residency in Queens County, hundreds of miles away from the quiet streets of Savona. For Dale and Doreen Robie, the geographical distance provided a necessary buffer, yet it could not erase the emotional proximity of the tragedy that had defined their lives for nearly 3 decades. They had spent over half their lives attending parole hearings, a biennial ritual that forced them to continuously relive the details of their 4-year-old son's murder. Their advocacy highlighted a painful friction within the New York justice system regarding the rights of victims versus the rehabilitation mandates for juvenile offenders. The Robie family became unwilling symbols of the debate surrounding the prosecution of children as adults. Smith's 1,994 conviction was a landmark application of laws designed to hold violent youth accountable, yet his eventual release tested the limits of the state's capacity for forgiveness. Throughout the process, the Robies maintained a dignified stance, often speaking about the importance of not allowing anger to corrode their remaining years. They focused on honoring Derrick not through vengeance, but through a persistent demand that the gravity of the crime never be minimized by the passage of time. Their resilience forced the parole board to weigh Smith's exemplary disciplinary record in prison against the permanent void left in the Savona community. In the wake of the release, the conversation in Steuben County shifted toward the treatment of victims during the parole process. The Robies' experience underscored the psychological toll of the indeterminate sentencing structure, where families remain in a state of suspended animation, awaiting decisions that occur in closed rooms. While justice reform advocates pointed to Smith's release as proof that the system works, demonstrating that even a child capable of extreme violence could eventually be deemed safe for society, local residents viewed the justice reform advocates' outcome as a failure to uphold the life sentence initially handed down. The legacy of the case extends beyond legal precedents. In Savona, the park where Derrick was taken remains a place of memory, though the physical landscape has changed. The community's loss of innocence in 1993 created a permanent skepticism regarding the safety of unsupervised play, fundamentally altering parenting styles in the region. For the Robies, the conclusion of Smith's incarceration marked the end of their legal battle, but not their grief. They continued to live in the same home where they raised Derrick, preserving his memory through quiet fortitude. The tragedy ultimately prompted a localized but intense evaluation of how the judicial system balances the prospect of redemption for a killer against the eternal silence of a victim. Derrick Robie is remembered not merely as a victim of a heinous act, but through his parents' enduring strength, standing as a testament to parental love that outlasted the confines of the court system.